Thanksgiving week, everybody. It's episode 141 of the Author Stories Podcast. I'm your host, Hank Garner. You can find all of the previous shows in the archives at hankgarner.com, and there in the right-hand sidebar, you can subscribe to the show on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, YouTube, wherever you listen on your PC, Mac, or telephone. You can subscribe there and make sure that you never miss an episode. It really does help if you click the subscribe button, and if you leave a review, that's even better. In the show notes of today's show, you can find out about all of our sponsors. I hope you will visit them and let them know how much you appreciate them sponsoring the show. ThirdScribe.com has a brand new look and feel. Rob and the guys over there are really doing something tremendous in really building a platform that connects readers and authors in a way that a lot of places have tried but not done very well. I really like the attention to detail that they're showing there at ThirdScribe, and I hope you'll go visit them at ThirdScribe.com and check it out. If you're a writer, they can give you everything that you need to launch your platform. If you're a reader, they can help you connect with the writers that you love. Go visit them at ThirdScribe.com. Also in the show notes today, click on my Patreon link and go find out how you can support the podcast and my writing and everything that I do. Patreon.com/Hank Garner. There's a link in the show notes as well.
Earth defeated the aliens once. Now they're back. After the devastating attack on Earth, the swarm fell back to regroup. Now, sooner than expected, they've returned to finish what they started, enslaving the human race. Samantha Avery, newly promoted captain of Avenger, has her hands full. A paid assassin seeking her death, a renegade officer working for the Swarm, and an enemy fleet bent on the destruction of the vital Wellington shipyards. As the Swarm launches a devastating attack against Britannia sector, Avery finds she must seek victory on multiple fronts. But Avery is a patriot for humanity. She's a dam standing tall against the alien flood. She is an Avenger.
Legacy Fleet Avenger, The First Swarm War Book 2 by Chris Porteau is now available on Amazon.com. From the best-selling world of Nick Webb's Legacy Fleet comes the follow-up to David Brunn's Invincible, Legacy Fleet Avenger, available now on Amazon.com. Hey everybody, I've got a guest with me for this short segment. Crystal Pico Watanabe is on with me to talk about Pico's House. And Crystal, thank you for coming on and doing this with me.
Oh, no problem. Thanks for having me.
Tell everybody a little bit about you and how you came to editing.
Well, I started off, I just so happened, several years ago, I came across Hugh Howey's Wool. And, I emailed him, and he's really good about email, right? So he offered to let me be a beta reader for him. And so I did it for second shift. And he was really impressed with my feedback. So he actually encouraged me to become an editor. And he said that he could, forward people on to me, because he said authors were always asking him for editor recommendations. And so, I that's eventually how I got into editing. So
Nice. So you kind of got in it at a trial by fire.
Yeah.
What are some of the projects that you've been involved with other than your one-on-one author editing? You've also been involved in some big anthologies and things like that. Tell us about some of those.
Yeah, one of the big jobs that Hugh actually got for me was he recommended me to Samuel Peralta, and Sam hired me to do a lot of his Future Chronicles anthologies. So I've done 5, I think, so far, maybe 6. I'd have to go back and check. I've done a lot of them, so I've gotten a lot of short story experience through the Future Chronicles. But those have been really fun, and it's a really really good learning experience for me, because I get to work with so many different authors, right? So
right. How different is it editing a collection of short stories as opposed to editing a novel?
I mean, it's difficult because I have to juggle so many different people and so many different projects at the same time. So it definitely requires a different mindset from like just dealing with one person and one novel and one story arc. But it's still fun. I mean, I kind of like having a little chaos mixed in occasionally, you know.
And you're available to edit standalone short stories or novels or anything in between, is that right?
Yeah. I do short stories, novellas, full-length novels. I have most of my experience in science fiction and fantasy and middle grade fiction, but I'm open to, other things. Like I also have clients that do crime and mystery thrillers and horror and things like that. So yeah, I'm open to a lot of different things.
Gotcha. Who do you think is your prime candidate? That someone that you think would be a really good fit for you and your services?
The sample edit that I do complimentary sample edits.
Okay.
And sample edits are actually a way for both of us to get to know each other, so that's why I like to do them. It gives the client a way to look at my editing style and see if, we see eye to eye on stories and comments and things like that. And for me, it's a good gauge for whether I like the story, whether I like the writing style, whether it also gives me a good idea of how much work is going to be needed, so it lets me quote accurately. So,
Gotcha. If an author is not really familiar with how the editor-author relationship works, what can an author expect if they contact you and you both feel like you're a good fit for each other? Kind of break down what the process is like. I think that's one of the most intimidating things. For a new author, I can speak from experience, is as an author, you pour your heart and soul into a story, and then you give it to someone kind of sheepishly, and you say, "Please tear this apart for me, and tell me all the ways that it's wrong." But what can people expect, and kind of how does that relationship work back and forth?
It depends on the author because some people really want brutal, honest feedback. Some people want people to be nicer, and so it all depends. I mean, that's why I know that I'm not the right editor for every author out there. And like I said, that's why I really like to do the sample edit, because I feel like you as the author have to be comfortable with what the editor is doing with your work, because ultimately it is your work. You always have to find an editor that you feel respects that it's your story in the end.
What kind of time frame does an author look for when they send you a book? How long does the back and forth between you and the author usually take?
I mean, it depends on the length of the project, and also every editor is different. So I can't speak for all editors. I mean, for me, a novel will take maybe about 2 weeks. Anywhere from 1 to 2 weeks, depending on the length. Sometimes it takes longer than that. And then when you get it back from the editor, then you have to go through the changes, which is thousands of changes, right? So that can take a while too. So I mean, if you want to publish next month, that's probably not very realistic to go looking for an editor like right now. I would look 2 to 3 months or more at least ahead of time for an editor. So
great. And your website is pikkoshouse.com. That's pikkoshouse.com. Authors, if you're looking for an editor, Crystal is one of the very best. Go look through her portfolio, look at some of the books that she's been involved with, read some of the testimonials that authors have posted there. You will not be disappointed, and I can speak to this, that the editor-author relationship is something very special, and when you find someone that you really click with, there's nothing better for your fiction than connecting with the editor that best suits you. And Crystal is one of the best out there. I highly recommend you go to pikkoshouse.com, contact Crystal, and get started. Where is that the best way to contact you, Crystal?
Yeah, I have a contact form on my website, or you can email me as well. So, yep.
Great. And if you tell Crystal that you heard about it on Author Stories, she'll give you a discount. You can get a $75 discount on manuscripts over 60,000 words or $25 on short stories. So please go by and check out her website. Give her a shout and let her know you heard about it on Author Stories. Thanks for joining me, Crystal.
Thank you.
Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. I'm really excited today to have Elizabeth Bonesteel on the show today because what science fiction writer has a better name than Bonesteel? That's amazing. Welcome to the show, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much.
I begin each show with a variation of the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
I don't really know when it crossed over into something that I wanted to do, but I started making up stories very young, I think because my parents were aggravated because I had trouble falling asleep. And if anyone out there has young children, I'm sure they're familiar with how it feels when the kids are up and you're not, and you would rather not be. So what they told me to do when I must have been 4 or 5 years old, was to make up my own stories. Probably so they could, just get some rest. And I started doing that long before I could read, just making things up to occupy my mind in these downtimes that you'd have before I could fall asleep. And I'm not sure if I got over the insomnia, but I did start telling stories, and I've just never stopped.
That's awesome. Do you remember what some of those early stories were?
Well, I do remember, but it's one of those things where you never know if it's a real memory or if you've just somehow rewritten it in your head. But the first one I remember picking up was of a puppy and a kitten who fell in love and had babies, and did in fact live in this beautiful little suburban neighborhood, complete with the white picket fence with their little puppy kitten babies. So, I was 5, and puppies and kittens were the best.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Did that help your insomnia?
I don't think so. I think what happens now is, I still write when I lie awake at night. If I'm away from the keyboard, I still tell stories in my head. I still work things out. I still noodle with ideas that I know are never actually going to end up, in a book anywhere. But it's just, that's the time when my mind is most active in terms of thinking things up. So no, my parents were still miserable.
But at least you were a little occupied.
At least I could occupy myself. I mean, that was the big thing, I think, was learning to occupy myself, because we also did a lot of long car rides when I was a kid. And I had my brother who was wonderful, but he didn't want to listen to me talk for 2 hours at a time. So eventually I had to just leave him alone and let him do his own thing. And so what else could I do? I could read, or I could write in my head, and eventually write on paper when I was old enough.
Right. At what point did you start realizing, oh, okay, this is more than just me entertaining myself at night. Maybe I'm an actual storyteller.
If I ever get to that point, I will tell you. It's a funny thing to describe yourself as a storyteller. I mean, I tell stories. I think most people do. In one way or another. In terms of writing them down and sharing them, the writing down part came first for years and years and years. And I know there was a period of time when I was in high school when I decided I just wanted to be a writer. And I think that was mostly because it was what I was doing recreationally. It was something that I did all the time. It was something that I got decent feedback on from my teachers and that sort of thing. And I have a distinct memory of my mother saying, well, that's fine, but you may want something that earns you an actual salary. So I didn't get into the writing for the general public really until recently, I would say. I should say I wrote a short when I was in college that's about as good as most of those shorts we all write in college. And I did get one rejection letter off of that. And then I didn't submit anything for another, 35 years? A long time. Not 35, but 30 years, a long time. I didn't submit anything really until I was querying the book that eventually became The Cold Between.
Wow. So, and we're going to get to that in just a minute, but were you an avid reader when you were a youngster?
Yes.
Yep.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, it's that was pretty much my main recreation. That and I liked horseback riding, but I didn't get to do much of that. So mostly I would read. Long car trips, anything. If I wasn't writing something, I was usually reading.
What sorts of things caught your imagination?
I mostly read science fiction when I was growing up, and that I say that now, and I always hesitate because so many of the titles that I read are kind of lost in time. This would have been during the mid to late 70s and early 80s, and I read a lot of one-off books. I read some of the classics, but there are a lot that I still haven't read. I still haven't read Dune. I get nagged a lot for that one. I finally read The Mote in God's Eye, I think on my honeymoon 12 years ago. I missed a lot of the big ones because I would sort of pick these kind of corner case books at this little place we had in our local drugstore, which is what what stood for a bookstore in the town that I grew up in. And I mistrusted authors that had a lot of titles, although I later realized that in this bookstore, even authors with a lot of titles, like I read a lot of Andre Norton, they didn't have a lot of her books there. So it didn't sort of tweak my suspicions by having like a whole row of just her.
What do you think it was that made you wary of these often published writers?
Well, I think in the 70s in particular, you got a lot of formulaic is not the right word, but mainstream science fiction was largely coming from a particular sort of perspective. And a lot of it was kind of sexist. And I found in my own experience for reading that I was less likely to be distracted by really poorly written female characters if I chose books that were written by women. So I think I mostly gravitated towards that. And because of the state of the market at the time, you had people like Le Guin, you had people like Andre Norton. Later on, you had Mercedes Lackey. But for the most part, the bulk of the titles of the known writers were mostly by men at that point. So because I was steering away from them, sorry guys, because I know a lot of those books are wonderful. Because I was steering away from them, I think that's part of what gave me that wariness. And I'm sure that there were times when I just hit something in a story. I know there was one book in particular that I read later on. I think when I was right out of college, it was the very first book that I could not finish. And it annoyed me because it was a really good book, but he had a female character that annoyed me so much. I literally could not finish the book. And I was so mad. I wanted to write the author a letter and say, I was really liking this, but I couldn't finish it because of that issue.
Oh, well, there are some extremely popular books that I've had the same experience with that you just come across a character and you know that you should love this character, but my goodness, they just grate on your nerves for whatever reason. Maybe they're just awfully stereotypical. Maybe they're just one-dimensional. But yeah, authors out there, make sure your characters are real and not just, don't get lazy with your writing.
Yeah. And, I think in this particular case, I think he was trying very hard not to be lazy. But as a result, right. She was super smart. She was super accomplished. She was beautiful. She was everything. And it was just sort of the flip side of the stereotype. So I feel like, he was trying. So I should have given him a shot at it. But the character was so unrealistic. And in a book that had really been going well for me, that it was incredibly frustrating.
That brings up a really great point, because I think that authors, in an attempt, like you said, to be inclusive and to really expand their viewpoint by bringing in characters that are different from them, or and try to see the world through others' eyes. We tend to dehumanize them by making them so perfect, because I think authors really do try to do the right thing, but you can carry it so far that you become offensive just because they're just not real.
Yeah, I mean, and offensive is it. I think in this particular case, sorry, that's my phone. I'm just going to ignore it. offensive in this particular case is probably overstating it. Because
I regret saying that when I said
I know
it.
what you mean, but I also know what you mean that in what authors try to do, and the trap that you can fall into, because that trap that you get sucked into is stereotyping, and good stereotyping must be a hero, must be handsome, beautiful, perfect, must be incredibly intelligent. That ends up being two-dimensional, and that's really the problem that you're talking about.
Right. We're talking about authors that were just cranking out work there. I think another problem is that when a genre or an industry matures, probably there's a want to just start cranking out what they think the reading audience is looking for, and then you get a publication mill that's just cranking out stuff. So and I know there have definitely been times the 70s and 80s when a lot of fantasy and sci-fi just got really saturated with just books that were just being cranked out for that reason.
Yes, although I will say that if I could figure out how to write 4 books a year that would all be bestsellers, I would crank it out in a second. But it doesn't.
Yeah.
I mean, and who wouldn't? So it's not like you can really begrudge people. But
right.
I think it was a really energetic time. I think the 70s and the 80s. I mean, it's an incredibly energetic time in science fiction now, but I think at the time when there really was this attempt to sort of figure out where it was going to address an adult audience. I mean, my parents were avid readers, not just science fiction, but comics when they were kids. And they got this very strong message that, comics are for children. And so with us, actually, they tried very hard to not do that. And I think there were a lot of people from my generation who were raised by these folks who were kids in the golden age of comics. And it's almost like we were allowed to help the whole genre come out of sort of genre obscurity. And not to say that the stuff that was written that's older was written for children, because it wasn't. But I think it very often was sort of dismissed as this edge thing, can't be literary, can't be important, can't really say anything to the general public, can't say anything about the world that we're living in, which is the most ludicrous thing you can say about science fiction, because science fiction is all about the world that we're living in. And I think it can explore it in a way that no other genre can. So I think that whole 70s and 80s period was a growing pain of sorts, where you had science fiction coming out of sort of this strange obscurity into the mainstream. And because of that, you end up with some mainstream stuff. And a lot of mainstream stuff is milled out. It is generic. It isn't very interesting. But part of that was the growth of the industry. So I can't really look back on it and criticize it too much, because it got us where we are now.
Right. Exactly. Well, it's kind of like that old argument about pop music. It's pop music because it's popular. There's something there that resonates with a large group of people. The same thing could be said for pop literature, for lack of a better term. And sometimes books are just fun, and they just don't need to be anything more than that. So we can talk about. We liked this thing before it was cool, and these authors didn't sell out or whatever. But, sometimes it's okay to write something that a lot of people love.
Selling out, especially if it lets you pay your mortgage, isn't always a bad thing. It's. I understand. I've read a lot of authors who, over time, they've started writing things that don't interest me as much. But so what? If they're still doing work that they like doing, if it's still getting them what they need as writers, and they're still entertaining large numbers of people, just not me, good for them. They don't need me.
Right.
They need enough of an audience. They don't need me. There are plenty of writers that I still love who probably also don't need me. But I, it's there's so much out there. It feels churlish to sort of get hung up on, well, that's too mainstream. What are you reading that for? How dare you?
Right. I absolutely agree with you. Were any of your friends or peers into the same kinds of things that you were?
We did trade a lot of books, me and my friends. They actually, I think it was one of my high school friends who originally got me into Tanith Lee, although she tended to like different books that she wrote, different ones than I had. So we traded a lot of books together. It was almost like this subversive thing. My brother read much more hard science fiction. I tended to read more fantasy as I was growing up. These days, I tend to prefer hard science fiction, which is good because that's sort of what I'm writing. But at the time, there was a lot of sort of strange expressiveness, and especially with someone like Tanith Lee, who was writing, almost gothic fantasy. And when you're a teenager, that can be very sort of dramatic and appealing, Plus she was amazing.
Right.
So there was that part of it as well. So yeah, I mean, we traded books, but it was mostly, I think there were 2 or 3 friends mostly that I did most of the trading with.
That's great. So since you were a fantasy fan and you had this storytelling bug, did you write the massive epic fantasy book in high school or college and if you did, is it sitting in a drawer somewhere?
Alas, no, I did not write that book. I never.
You wanted to,
no,
though,
I
didn't you?
Actually, I never wrote fantasy. It's a funny thing. I wrote a lot of romance. Teenager, remember? I wrote a lot of mysteries. In fact, mystery was the first genre I gravitated to as a writer and adult. I did a little bit of sort of alt future kind of stuff, but fundamentally, I wrote police procedural kinds of things. Never finished any of them, so I'm afraid I don't have anything in a trunk from that genre either. But I did eventually switch to reading primarily mysteries for a while. And then when I started getting serious about writing, for some reason, it just all came out. Well, I know why. It's because Star Trek got rebooted and I got sucked into everything again. And so when I started writing again, it all came out as science fiction.
We see, and there's another touchstone for these things that are wildly popular and mainstream, and how they affect us and encourage us and inspire us to do things. See, it all comes back
yes.
around. What did you study in college?
My major was math, which I loved until it got abstract, and then it was extremely difficult. I didn't study anything practical. I did complete all the classes for an English degree, but I never actually declared it. So that explains to you how organized I am. I took a couple of short story classes, which were about what you'd expect, in that they were somewhat useful in that it was my first exposure to real peer critique. But in terms of writing anything finished, I did that thing I mentioned that I got the rejection off of. That was my college short story from my short story class. What
was it about?
It was kind of a Margaret Atwood Handmaid's Tale kind of thing. And I hadn't read that book, but it was around the same time. And so when the rejection came in, I told myself that was why. It was just too similar to The Handmaid's Tale, when in reality it was overwrought and full of purple prose. But I was fairly proud of it because it was the first thing I'd actually sort of finished and taken feedback on and gone through revisions on. So as an educational piece, it was wonderful for me, but I am, at this point in my life, absolutely thrilled that nobody bought it.
Yeah, could you imagine what that would have brought you?
No.
Yeah. Sometimes the no is the kindest thing that we could have happen.
And everyone was extremely professional, which is wonderful. So my first exposure to the published history was a very professional form rejection, which I still have in a box somewhere.
Nice. So you said earlier that there was like a 30-year gap between submitting something and then getting back to the love of this thing. So what happened in that intervening time?
Oh, life. I always wrote. That's the one thing. And I try to tell people that because often people look at me and tag me as a late bloomer because, I'm 52 years old. My second book comes out next week. That is late for a debut novelist, but the truth of it is I was writing all along. I just wasn't writing with an eye towards publication or even completion. But there was a lot of what I was doing was processing language, developing my own style, figuring out the kinds of stories I liked to tell, sort of honing the skill set before I finally sat down to write an actual novel. So depending on how you look at it, I started writing seriously in 2010, or I started writing seriously when I was 5. I mean, you could make the argument either way, really.
So in this down period, you were still writing, you were still, story ideas would come to you and you would write them down and work on them. Did you just, consider it a hobby and this was just part of who you are?
I would say yes to the second, no to the first. I never thought of writing as a hobby because it's sort of this compulsion, which, is obnoxious because I do actually get cranky if I don't do it for a while. I can go, I don't know, maybe a week. And then I just get really sort of irritable and out of sorts. So it is kind of this thing that I have to do. It's this thing that needs to be done regularly, like eating, sleeping, exercise, all that sort of stuff in order for me to maintain a healthy life.
Right.
So hobby was, I did counted cross stitch for a while, hobby is crochet, it's this, right. And this is not to disparage the people who are serious about that stuff because I'm terrible at both of those. And I greatly admire people who are really good at them. But those are hobbies for me, noodling around, on my computer. I mean, it's funny because I had a career as a software engineer. I was in software engineering for 27 years, which is really what I did with that intervening time in order to pay the mortgage. That's a hobby. That always felt like a hobby. I coded because it was fun, not because it really gave me any great, emotional rush to do so. Whereas writing was this thing that I just needed to do.
That's very interesting, and there's a lot of people listening right now that are probably shaking their head because they completely understand that need, that this is something that has to come out of me, and I'm going to make everyone around me miserable if I don't do it.
I could give you references of people that I made miserable.
Yeah, my wife would completely understand, exactly. I promise. But I've had lots of authors on the show, most recently Brandon Sanderson, that we had this particular conversation about, and he talked about that he was a writer long before he was ever published. He wrote like 13 novels before he ever got one sold, and that this was just something he was going to do, and that the fact that he was published or not did not affect his decision to write books. He was going to be writing books. He hoped to be published. That was always a dream and an aspiration. But that was his idea of himself was not hinging on whether he published or not. And we had this great conversation about no other art or other activity or hobby or whatever you want to call it. Very rarely do we hang that sort of requirement on these other things we do in life. So if you play basketball every Wednesday night, nobody is going to come up to you and ask you when the Chicago Bulls are coming to pick you up. It's just what you do. Nobody puts that sort of obligation on you. But as soon as you say, I'm writing a book, everybody wants to know when it's going to be published and all this sort of stuff. So did you still have the aspiration that one day I'm going to publish this novel and this is something I'm working toward, or was it honestly just this thing that's just part of who you are and you were going to do it regardless?
Well, I'm going to say both. And I actually really like what he said about that, because writing, I think, especially if you are trying to be published, you need to find another reason to do it other than the sale, because writing for publication involves rejection for everyone. I don't care who you are. I don't care how many books you have out there. There's always going to be someone who says, no, I don't want this. And you have to have a reason to keep going because, it stings. And it
Right.
it depends on the circumstances. Some rejections sting worse than others, but I've never spoken to anyone who's just like, oh yeah, whatever, on to the next thing. I'm sure those people are out there. I am not one of them. So you need something other than that grand ambition for publication if you're going to keep going, because writing is one of those things that you have to practice. You have to keep doing it. You have to keep forming stories. You have to keep working on your skill set, because it fades if you don't use it. And if it fades, you're never going to get anything published, and your chances are zero.
Yeah.
What was your question again? I just completely went off in the weeds.
We're just talking about that that attitude that you're going to do this whether you get published or not, and you know.
Well, I'll just say that for myself, part of what made me try to query was actually because self-publication has become, from a technical standpoint, a fairly easy thing to do. Right. So I had this idea that, well, if I get rejected, I can always put it out myself. And that gave me kind of an ego cushion to shove the little bird out of the nest. And I'm not really sure that I expected things to go the way that they did. I had always had this vague idea, this sort of formless idea with no actual plans and ambition attached to it, that someday there would be a book with my name on it on the shelf, back when that was the only way you could get books. So yes, I always wanted to be published. No, I wasn't always working towards it. So, you know, it was sort of this weird dual fantasy in my head. And I don't know that I ever counted on reality being a thing at the end of it. But the writing was always going to happen, no matter what.
Which brings us to the fact that you do have 2 novels with your name on them now, or one and one, which will be out when this airs. And they're the Central Core novels, the first one being The Cold Between. How did you go from this person who has this other career, you write as it's just something that you do, to then having a finished novel, and then getting that finished novel out into the world?
Well, here, and this is actually perfect timing, I'm going to plug National Novel Writing Month.
Yes, because today, when we're recording this, is the beginning of NaNoWriMo.
Yes, and I'm 1668 today, so there.
I am 30. Hold on. I just posted mine a minute ago. It's shoot. I am 3574.
That's fabulous. That is a hell of a word count for one day. That's incredible. Congratulations.
Well, that gives me pad for another day.
Yeah.
So, because something will happen, and
it's always Thanksgiving that hangs me up. But
that's right.
But in any case, what happened is I started in early 2010. For whatever reason, I started forming these characters in my head, and it's actually none of them that are the characters that ended up in The Cold Between, but they were these people that started coming to life much more substantively. And actually 2 of them became Greg Foster, who's one of my protagonists in this series of books. But he was 2 people for a while, which may actually explain a lot about him. But what happened is November rolled around, and I'd sort of heard about National Novel Writing Month. And I thought, well, you know, I write a lot, so can I do this? Is this a thing? And it was sort of scary, the idea of just kind of jumping in and no editing and don't go back and fix things. And, you know, I love that the advice that you get would be things like, well, write out all of your numbers, because that adds extra words. Don't use contractions. Refer to everyone by first name, last name. These are the kinds of, and the effect of advice like that is really freeing, because it's like, this does not have to be poetry. It just has to be words. And I did it, and I got 50,000 words, and I looked at it afterwards, and I said, wow, this is almost a complete story. And as it happened, when I went back to edit that and work on it, it didn't hold my interest enough for me to finish it. I got it up to about 80,000, I think, before I finally disposed of it. But there were germs in there that grew into what became The Cold Between, which was actually originally 2 books. It was my 2011 and 2012 NaNoWriMo novels smushed into one.
So, where did you first hear about National Novel Writers Month?
I don't remember. I don't know if it was a friend of mine who referred to it, but I just remember Googling it one day and it's like, oh, they have a website. Oh, they have rules. Oh, here's all this information. And how come I didn't know about this before? So I can't give anyone credit.
Well, I think a lot of people have stumbled into writing via NaNoWriMo. That's such an amazing thing. I know so many people that have. My first book came out of a November project, so I'm like you. I'm eternally grateful for this thing that we do in November.
Oh goodness, yes. I think I credit it for teaching me how to finish a novel.
Yes, I agree. There's something there. I think that is the most important lesson, is getting to the end of something that cannot be talked about enough. I know lots of people that have just files full of books with awesome beginnings, but an awesome beginning does you no good if you can't get to the end of it. Yeah. And one thing I think some people don't realize about NaNoWriMo, it very rarely produces a publishable book at the end of November.
Oh yeah.
But like you said, you do come away with great ideas and something that is very similar to what a great book could be. And having a blob of something that you can edit is way better than sitting down at the keyboard with a blank screen and having no idea where to start. So just the idea of going through the motions and working those muscles is just an amazing thing for the creative process.
It is, and it is very much like exercise. You can't just sit down and start going. It's something that you have to work at. You have to keep doing. And NaNoWriMo is exhausting. And at the end of it, when you sit down to do whatever you usually do, 400, 500 words, it's going to feel so easy.
Right. Absolutely. So you wound up with this book that had the kernel of a great book in it. How did you then shape that into what became The Cold Between?
I stole some of the characters. I stole the location. Volhynia was in that first book, which is the colony that the first part of The Cold Between it takes place on. And basically I screwed things up for people a little bit. The first book that I wrote, everybody was too happy. I mean, there was a murder mystery. That was another thing that I lifted from it. There was somebody dead, and they had to figure out how all of that happened. But everybody got along too well. Everybody was too happy. Lovely, but nobody wants to read that. So so I gave people more difficult lives, more difficult backgrounds, more situations that were impossible to get out of. It's one of those rules, and I'm going to paraphrase it wrong, but you've seen online, Pixar's 26 rules for storytelling. One of them is something along the lines of, what is the worst possible thing that could happen to your character right now? And if you're stuck on a point, and it's like, well, I'm sailing along and I'm worried that there's not enough conflict, or there's nothing going on here, or what happens now? What's the worst possible thing that could happen to your character? Short maybe of killing them off if you need them for the rest of the story. And I did a lot of that with this first sort of happy little novel to turn into The Cold Between, where, I feel like at least a lot of the characters spend the bulk of the story being really unhappy.
Wow. So what's the setting for the book, and what's the setup?
The Cold Between is basically I have Galileo, which is my starship, and Greg Foster, who I named earlier, is the captain. Elena Shaw, the chief of engineering, and there's this colony, Volhynia, which is a fairly wealthy colony, which is kind of unusual. We're about 1,000 years in the future, just to give you a reference. There's faster than light travel. We've colonized a big chunk of the galaxy, and they're all on shore leave. And she hooks up with this guy, which isn't a thing that she does, but he turns out to be nice, which is, that's a bit of a romance trope, but it works, I think, for the story. Because what happens while she's spending the night with this guy is that her ex-boyfriend is actually murdered on this same colony. And this fellow that she's hooked up with is, for the local police department anyway, the obvious suspect. And so, of course, she can provide him with an alibi. But as it turns out, all of this is there's conspiracy behind it, and it's somewhat tied into things that her own military has been dealing with, and specifically acts that happened a quarter of a century before. And so in trying to, I mean, she starts out in all of this saying, I'm going to go and I'm going to get this guy out of jail because this is stupid, and figuring then the police will pick it all up. She doesn't walk into the situation thinking, I'm going to get up to my eyeballs in this. But what happens is the local police are not particularly interested in solving the crime, which pisses her off, because ex-boyfriend or not, he did not deserve to actually be killed. That crossed a line for her. And people with ex-boyfriends, maybe it doesn't cross a line for you, but it did cross a line for this particular character. So she gets annoyed, and she goes in to try to solve the crime herself, which kind of puts her a bit at odds with her captain, who also wants justice for this dead guy, but is of course much more involved in the political side of it, and being told what he can and can't do, and how he's allowed to lean on the government, and maybe he's just going to have to let this go. But it all has tendrils into this old accident from 25 years before, where actually Greg's mother was killed. So he's got that emotional pull in that direction, even as he's trying to be, Mr. by the book in all of this. So they all end up making decisions that are probably more emotionally based than they should. And, they end up on the other side of the universe and stuff blows up. So that's basically the book.
So how did you you got the book written? Did you feel like this idea was inspired, or maybe that's the wrong term, but did you feel like this was different this time when you were writing it?
The only thing that felt different to me is that it held my interest long enough for me to actually sit with it for a long time, to do the editing and the polishing, which is, of course, probably, for me at least, the more time-consuming part of writing. Getting the first draft out, but sitting with it and kind of smushing it into something that looks the way you want it to. It's a whole different effort. And that would often be where I'd lose interest. Either I'd, as you pointed out, the beautiful beginning, I'd write the first 3 chapters and I'd revise them until I was so bored I couldn't see straight. Or I'd just write something that didn't hold my attention. And this one held my attention. I didn't really look at it and think, oh, this is publishable because it's holding my attention. All I thought was, hey, maybe I'll finish this. And I did. And actually what happened is the first draft was only half the story, and I'd been writing the sequel. And it was my agent who suggested to me that maybe what this really wanted to be was a single book instead of 2 separate books. So there was a whole extra stage of squashing these 2 things together and ditching 100,000 words in order to make it, a decent length. Yeah, that was interesting.
So where did the agent come in?
I queried the first book, which actually was solely the mystery story of who killed this guy, and where all that came from. And in speaking with her, she actually said, do you have more than this? And I sent her, I had a draft of the second one, but it was at that stage where no other human being in the world is allowed to see it. So I sent her a synopsis. Mm-hmm. And she said, you've got to put these 2 together. So what I did really was I revised that first novel by combining it with the second novel. And that's where the representation came into it.
And the book eventually landed with HarperCollins.
Yes.
What was that experience like?
Nice. Selling a book is nice. Having someone say, gee, yes, we would like to give you money in order to publish this is a lovely thing. And they've been really a terrific bunch to work with.
That's awesome. And that first book is still doing really well on the Amazon charts, and now you have a follow-up coming out. It'll be out when you hear this interview, and that's called Remnants of Trust. How did you carry the story forward in the second book?
Well, it's interesting because, National Novel Writing Month, I'm actually working on book 4.
Awesome.
And what's interesting writing a series is that you have an established set of facts that you can't screw around with. And in some ways, that's really frustrating. But in other ways, that's great. Because where I started with this book was, okay, logically, what happened next? There's consequences to all of these things that happened. It's the end of the go-between. There are a lot of things tied up in a little bit of a bow, but there's consequences to what people did, to the choices that they made. Which ones can I pull a story out of? What happened to these people next? And what happened basically, and none of this is, all of this is in the Amazon blurb. I'm always worried about spoilers, and it's like everybody says everything in the reviews anyway, so I don't know why I even worry about it. But Greg and Elena are court-martialed, and they're slapped on the wrist, somewhat mysteriously, because what the consequences of what they did in the first book are actually fairly major. So there's a little bit of the suspicion of, why did we get off so easy? And then in the shadow of that, one of their fellow starships is attacked and destroyed, and a lot of people are killed. And that actually ties into another player in what happened in the first book. But really, I don't have my blurb hat on for this, obviously. Really, I think what this book is about, the first book to me felt like it started with the murder of one man and the need for justice for that one person, and it grew into something. The events of the story are much bigger than one person. Whereas this starts out with, a fairly major scene of carnage. And it becomes really the story of how one person deals with it. So it's, my editor is rolling his eyes listening to this right now, saying, "Can't you say anything about the book?" There's a kidnapping. There's a tie-in to this horrible mission that Elena was on. It's which is in the prologue, which Harper put up on Facebook.
Yeah.
Just something that went really, really wrong. And this entire attack ends up being tied to that same location in ways that people didn't really expect. So once again, I sort of have this, haunted past coming into stuff. I'm big on haunted pasts. We all have a haunted past. And, it always comes in and bites you when you don't want to deal with it. So, I've got the captain of the ship that's destroyed, who's dealing with guilt on top of everything else, even though it wasn't his fault and there wasn't anything he could have done about it. I've got Elena dealing with trying to help figure out who perpetrated this when it's all tied into this really nasty event from her past. And I've got who just, somebody needs to give the man a cookie. He's just having a really bad time with everything.
Something really great about space opera and some of the military sci-fi and things that kind of span some of those genres, and I would put Star Trek in this category I'm talking about, is that we really fall in love with this cast of characters. It's not all just Captain Kirk, it's not all just Spock, but it's how they interact with one another. It's their diverse backgrounds and how they either set aside all those differences or bring those differences in, and the sum of the differences make up something that is more than they all are. How fun is it writing a cast of characters like that in this?
To me, character is the fun of writing. I mean, that's it right there. The world building, all that sort of stuff, that's nice enough. That's entertainment. But these people, I mean, they live in my head and they talk to me. It's in like the non-needing medication way. But it's, to me, I get drawn into stories with character. And you mentioned Star Trek, which is a great example, because one of the things I'm thinking about Star Trek is I watch Next Generation with my daughter all the time on Netflix. It's wonderful having all this stuff on Netflix. But this is a universe that's been built, that was built originally in the 1960s, that's been expanded on, that's been pulled this, that, and the other way, but, has maintained some common elements through this. And in all of the reboots and all of the shows, there have been so many situations where they've just written these deplorable, horrible episodes. just really dreadful stuff happens. And you're sitting there thinking, why am I sitting here watching this, when I could go clip my toenails? I mean, it's just really awful, bad episodes. And yet it survives. This entire universe that's been built can survive the space alligators. It can survive these contrived, strange war conflict things that don't make any sense. It has survived really what for each series has been cultural references that are very much tied to the current time where the show was being televised. The original series is very much 1960s. Next Generation, late 80s, early 90s. And there's a lot of it that just doesn't work as narrative now because it's a different world.
Right.
And yet, because the characters as drawn are so powerfully written, we don't care. I have forgiven Star Trek, I think, more than any other franchise out there because I love these people. Even when they irritate me, even if I can say, they could have written that character better in this episode. Beverly Crusher gets the short shift on everything. But she's marvelous. She's I adore her. I adore all of them. And that to me has always been the attraction in storytelling. So that is what I try to do with my own storytelling is I get into these people's heads and I try to sort of show them to other folks. I try to put them in other people's heads, I suppose, to write them well enough so that they come to life.
And that's what we want. We want to read a book that has really fancy window dressing, but at the heart of it, we want people that remind us of us and that go through things like we do and hopefully come out the other side better for it. Or give us a chance to resonate with all of the emotions of life. So, I think that's what we need. Yeah. Elizabeth Bonesteel, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show. Your new book is called Remnants of Trust. It's available now at Amazon.com and wherever you can find great books. I'll put links to it in the show notes. Where can people connect with you to follow your writing and keep up with the series as it unfolds and all of that good stuff?
On the web, I'm at elizabethbonesteel.com, which also has a link to my blog. And on Twitter, I am Liz_Monster. But if you search on Elizabeth Bonesteel, it'll come up because I'm the only one.
Excellent. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Thanks for listening to Author Stories. I'm your host, Hank Garner. Please go visit hankgarner.com for all of the archives. If you'll stay tuned just a moment, I've got a special clip for you from Legacy Fleet Avenger by Chris Porto. I think you're really going to like it. Also, don't forget to go to patreon.com/Hank Garner. If you've gotten some benefit from the Author Stories podcast or you enjoy my writing, please go sign up. It really would help. Thank you so much.
Bridge, ISS Intrepid. Admiral Melinda Kilgore watched as their fighter wings echeloned, one behind the other, into the enemy's lines. It felt a bit to her like watching bugs splatter on a windshield, but many were getting through to the line of carriers behind the protective cloud of swarm fighters. The fighter wing from Independence had already passed the storm of swarm resistance and was threatening the first capital ship. The enemy pilots were adapting to circumstance and circling back on the sixes of the birds that slipped past, but if they could disrupt the greater enemy numbers long enough, Avenger herself, followed by Intrepid's massive firepower, could divide the oncoming swarm battle line. It was an old strategy. Break a stronger enemy into weaker parts and defeat each one in turn, rather than face superior numbers as a cohesive force. It was also a long shot, but it was humanity's only chance at victory here. Who are you kidding, Melinda? She thought. There's no victory here, only death delayed. The swarm force was just too overwhelming. Admiral, Spartan reports its task force ready to engage enemy fighters, said her comms officer. Execute, Lieutenant. Behind her, Kilgore heard the order relayed to the destroyer's captain. Spartan and her escorts had one task: plunge headlong into the cloud of swarm fighters and provide close fire support to their own fighter wings. Useless against the carriers, the destroyer's shields would offer some protection against attack by the enemy fighters. Then the bigger ships, led by Avenger, would take on the line of carriers. "Everything according to plan," said Captain Vickers, his eyes like hers glued to the view screen. "And it's a good plan, ma'am." "So far," replied Kilgore, "so far." But it all hinged on the blocker following up the destroyers and charging through that weakened enemy line. It all hinged on Avenger.
Avenger by Chris Porteau, available now at Amazon.com.